On a sweltering evening at the Hale estate, Aisha Coleman, the woman who had spent 12 hours scrubbing marble floors, hand-pressing designer suits, and quietly fixing the structural errors in the blueprints on her employer's desk, was forced to take her dinner in the dirt, inches away from two snarling Dobermans. Not because the kitchen was full, not because she had been careless, but because Victoria Hale had decided, with icy arrogance, that Aisha's stench of poverty would ruin the atmosphere of her high society dinner party. So, Aisha sat on the ground in her stained gray uniform, eyes cast downward, clutching a plate of cold rice while Victoria stood over her with crossed arms, watching with disgust as if Aisha were just another piece of yard furniture. Humiliated, exhausted, and stripped of her dignity in a home built on her tireless labor. But what Victoria didn't know, what none of the elite guests pulling into the driveway could possibly suspect, was that the maid in the dirt was actually the most brilliant architectural mind in the city. She was a ghost architect, a blacklisted genius rebuilding her empire from the shadows. And in less than 4 minutes, the arrival of a blackout Maybach would shatter the silence of that estate, expose a billionaire's secret savior, and turn an act of cruelty into a reckoning that would change the city's skyline forever. Before she was reduced to the help for the Hales, Aisha Coleman was a rising titan of architectural engineering, a woman whose father's legacy was built on steel and integrity. She wasn't born to be invisible. She was a brilliant visionary whose designs once promised to redefine the city. But her brilliance made her a target. A corporate conspiracy, fueled by the very men she trusted, framed her for a catastrophic bridge failure, leaving Aisha blacklisted, impoverished, and branded a failure. The fallout didn't just take her license. It took her home and her pride, forcing her into a life of servitude just to keep a roof over her ailing grandmother's head. Society saw a woman in a stained apron, someone easier to ignore than to respect. But Aisha did what true builders do. She laid a new foundation in the dark. By day, she endured Victoria's calculated cruelty. By night, she used her servant's access to the estate's library to fix the fatal flaws in the city's newest multi-billion-dollar project, the Diamond Spire. She was constructing a future powerful enough to restore her father's name. So when Victoria Hale ordered her to eat with the dogs, she thought she was breaking a servant's spirit. She had no idea she was insulting the only person on earth capable of saving her husband's failing empire, or that Aisha's greatest triumph would come not from the dirt, but from the moment a powerful man stepped out of a car and finally called her by her true title, partner. The Georgia sun had a way of turning the humidity into a physical weight, but for Aisha Coleman, the heaviest burden was the gray polyester of her uniform. It was a fabric designed to make the wearer blend into the shadows of the hallway, a visual signal that she was part of the house's machinery rather than its heart. Every morning at 6 a.m., Aisha transformed into the shadow, her natural hair pulled back tight, her eyes trained to look at baseboards and floor tiles instead of the faces of the people who inhabited the Hale estate. Her day began not with architectural drafts, but with the scent of lemon oil and the abrasive texture of a scrub brush. She moved through the vast, echoing rooms with a rhythmic precision, her mind compartmentalizing the drudgery. While her hands worked to erase the evidence of the Hale's existence, the wine rings on mahogany, the dust on the crown molding, her brain was elsewhere, calculating load-bearing capacities and wind shear resistance. She was a woman who had once stood on construction sites and commanded the respect of veteran foremen, now reduced to navigating the exact pressure needed to buff a marble countertop without leaving a streak. The most dangerous part of her day, and the part she craved most, was the cleaning of Mr. Hale's private study. It was a room filled with the smell of expensive leather and the arrogance of a man who played at being an architect without possessing the soul for it. While Victoria Hale patrolled the upper floors like a warden, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on Aisha's every movement, the study offered a brief, precarious sanctuary. Aisha moved the feathered duster over the massive oak desk, her eyes immediately locking onto the blueprints spread across the surface like a challenge. They were the plans for the Diamond Spire, the project that was supposed to be the Hale's crowning achievement. Even through the haze of her exhaustion, Aisha could see the errors. They screamed at her from the paper, a misalignment in the secondary tension cables, a fundamental misunderstanding of the soil density at the build site. It was the same kind of oversight that had been used to frame her years ago, the kind of mistake that looked like a minor calculation on paper but felt like a funeral in reality. With one ear tuned to the click of Victoria's heels in the hallway, Aisha would set down her cleaning rags. Using a pencil she kept tucked in her waistband, she made minute, surgical marks on the margins of the husband's drafts. She didn't just fix his math. She redesigned the flow of the structural loads, whispering the corrections onto the page with the ghost of her former authority. She was the invisible hand ensuring the building wouldn't collapse, even as her own life felt like it was in a state of permanent ruin. The humiliation was a constant, low-grade fever. It came in the way Victoria would walk past her and adjust her posture, as if Aisha's mere presence in the room was a contaminant. It was in the breezy certainty of being treated like a tool rather than a person. But as Aisha scrubbed the dirt from the floors she walked on, she took a cold, sharp comfort in the truth. She was the only thing standing between the Hales and a catastrophe of their own making. She was the architect of their safety, working in a stained uniform, waiting for the moment the silence would finally break. The memory of the rain always came first. It was a torrential, silver downpour that had blurred the lights of the Savannah riverfront on the night the world ended. Back then, Aisha Coleman didn't wear a gray polyester uniform. She wore a high-visibility vest over a tailored suit, her boots caked in the honest mud of a construction site she had managed with surgical precision. She was 32, the lead structural engineer for the Blackwood Bridge project, and she was happy. Aisha had been the first to see the hairline fractures in the pylon casings, the invisible burn of a disaster waiting to happen. She had spent 48 hours straight in her office, fueled by black coffee and the terrifying certainty that the secondary tension cables were failing. She had written the memos. She had flagged the substandard steel. She had begged her mentors at the firm to halt the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But in the world of high-stakes infrastructure, a woman's intuition is often dismissed as excessive caution, and her data is treated as an inconvenient expense. The fall happened at 3:14 a.m. The bridge didn't just break. It groaned. A deep, metallic scream that Aisha still heard in her dreams when the house was too quiet. Because she had been the one on site, the one with her name on the final safety inspections, the corporate machine didn't just look for a scapegoat, it built one. Her charming husband, a junior partner at the same firm, had been the one to quietly swap the digital logs, rerouting the paper trail of negligence until every finger pointed at Aisha. The fallout was surgical and total. She watched her reputation, built through a decade of sacrifice and earned excellence, dissolve in a courtroom where the truth was less important than a clean balance sheet. The judge had called it negligence. The headlines called it a tragedy. When she lost her license, it felt like her very hands had been cut off. She was a woman who could read a blueprint the way others read music, and suddenly the music had stopped. Coming home from the legal proceedings was a different kind of prison. The house in Cascade Heights was gone. The bank accounts were drained by legal fees, and the man who had looked like a blessing but moved like a curse was gone with the wind. She was left with a scarlet letter on her career that everyone read and nobody admitted to. By the time she stood in the Hale estate years later, holding a feather duster instead of a transit level, the ghost architect had learned to hide her genius behind a mask of subservience. She had learned that people like Victoria Hale only see what they want to see, and they never want to see the person who is smarter than them cleaning their baseboards. Aisha had lost her pride, her title, and her freedom, but as she polished the silver in the dining room, she looked at the reflection of the woman in the gray uniform and knew the foundation was still there. She had survived a collapse designed to destroy her, and in the ruins, she was beginning to find the strength to build something that could never be torn down. The weight of the past didn't just haunt Aisha, it instructed her. Every night, after the Hale silver was polished and Victoria had finally stopped pacing the floorboards with her breezy certainty of command, Aisha retreated to the only sanctuary she had left, a small public library 3 miles from the estate. While the world slept, Aisha shed the gray polyester of her invisibility and became a titan again, hunched over a flickering monitor that reflected the fire in her eyes. It was during one of these midnight sessions that she saw it, the digital renderings for Marcus Sterling's Diamond Spire. As she scrolled through the public-facing technical specs, a cold shiver, sharper than the library's air conditioning, raced down her spine. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a haunting. The load-bearing redistribution in the Foundation's East Quadrant was an exact mirror of the flaw that had caused the Savannah Bridge to scream and buckle years ago. It was the same structural negligence that had been used to bury her father's reputation and her own career. Aisha knew Marcus Sterling by reputation, a man who moved like a blessing, but was surrounded by advisors who treated human safety like an optional luxury. She knew that if he broke ground on those plans, hundreds of lives would be resting on a foundation made of sand and arrogance. For a moment, the paralyzing imposter syndrome clawed at her, whispering that she was just a maid in a stained uniform, a woman with a scarlet letter on her name. Who would listen to a ghost? But then she thought of the invisible burn of the people who would be turned into statistics if that building fell. She thought of her father's legacy, a name that had been whispered in a small kitchen as a symbol of integrity. Her fingers, calloused from scrubbing the Hale's floors, began to fly across the keyboard with surgical precision. She didn't just write a letter. She authored a manifesto of salvation. For 6 nights, she stayed until the librarian rattled her keys, producing a 40-page correction that dissected the Diamond Spire's blueprints with the hard-earned certainty of a master. She redrew the secondary tension cables, recalculated the soil density, and provided a clean, liquid solution to a billion-dollar catastrophe. She poured every ounce of her hidden genius into the document, hearing the music of the architecture in a way others didn't even know was there. When she finally hit send on the anonymous encrypted file, she didn't feel triumph. She felt a quiet closure. She had sent the truth into the void, a message in a bottle from a woman the world had decided didn't deserve a table. As she walked back to the estate in the pre-dawn light to begin her morning shift of dirt and blueprints, she felt a strange peace. She was still a maid, and Victoria Hale would still treat her like furniture within the hour. But Aisha Coleman was no longer just surviving. She had become the architect of a future she might never get to see, holding herself to a standard that required no audience but her own conscience. She had no idea that her stolen hours had just set a blackout Maybach in motion, or that the silence of her life was about to become the loudest reckoning Georgia had ever seen. The air in the Hale estate was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying ozone of a coming storm. It was the night of the Founders' Gala, and Victoria Hale moved through the foyer like a predator in silk, her arms crossed as she surveyed the perfection Aisha had spent 18 hours creating. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and the silver service was polished to such a high luster it seemed to hum. Aisha stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, her gray uniform damp with sweat, her hands trembling slightly from the long hours and harsh treatment that were the price of her survival. Aisha had missed lunch to ensure the centerpieces were flawless, and the longing for a seat at a table was a dull ache in her chest. She had prepared a small plate of rice and greens, a recipe from her father's kitchen, and was about to sit at the small wooden station in the pantry when Victoria's heels clicked sharply against the floor. The elegant woman didn't enter the room so much as she invaded it, her expression one of cold, judgmental disgust. "Aisha, what do you think you're doing?" Victoria's voice was a low, dangerous whip. "I was just going to eat, ma'am, before the guests." "Not in here," Victoria interrupted, her lip curling as if Aisha were a contaminant. "The Sterling party is arriving in 20 minutes. I won't have the stench of poverty, or the noise of the help breathing the same air as my guests. It's a matter of hygiene, really." Aisha didn't flinch. Her face had long ago become a wall that couldn't be humiliated. "The kitchen is spotless, Mrs. Hale. I've scrubbed every surface you're standing on. And yet you are still in it," Victoria replied with the breezy certainty of a woman who had never considered the person in front of her to be fully human. She gestured toward the back door, where the 2 Dobermans were already pacing, their metal bowls clattering against the stone. "Take your plate outside. Sit by the guard dogs. They understand their place, and it's high time you remembered yours." Aisha picked up her tin plate, the metal cold against her calloused palms. She walked past Victoria, whose arms were crossed in a posture of dominance, and stepped out into the humid Georgia evening. The dogs, muscular and alert, paused their feeding to watch her. Aisha sat on the dirt path, her legs folded to the side, her posture slouched and almost collapsed inward as she shared the ground with the animals. Through the expansive glass windows, she could see Victoria sipping champagne from a china cup, watching her through the pane with a look of emotional detachment. Victoria then turned up the volume on the opera music, the soaring notes designed to drown out the very existence of the woman in the dirt. Aisha bowed her head over her plate, not in prayer for revenge, but for the hard-earned certainty that her character was not defined by the dirt she sat in. She looked at the dogs, the only creatures on the property who saw her as she actually was, and waited. She knew something Victoria didn't. The music was about to stop, and the roar of power was already turning off the highway. In the distance, the first flash of headlights from a blackout Maybach began to cut through the dark. The headlights of the blackout Maybach didn't just illuminate the driveway. They cut through the humid Georgia night like a declaration of war. Aisha remained on the dirt path, her posture slouched and her eyes fixed on the ground, even as the heavy crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of the city's most powerful presence. Beside her, the Dobermans went rigid, their muscular bodies alert as the luxury vehicle came to a halt with a sound like controlled power. Through the glass of the kitchen window, Aisha could see Victoria Hale's transformation. The cold, judgmental woman instantly uncrossed her arms, smoothing her sleek black dress and adjusting her expression into the mask of breezy certainty she reserved for guests who mattered. Victoria hurried toward the front door, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the marble she had forced Aisha to scrub on her hands and knees. The car door opened, and Marcus Sterling stepped out. He was a man who moved like a blessing, but possessed a stride that signaled urgency and authority. Beside him was Elena Sterling, composed and observant, her presence adding to the weight of the moment. Victoria was already on the porch, her face lit with a practiced, predatory smile. She reached out a hand, likely prepared to offer the porcelain coffee or champagne that Aisha had been forbidden from even smelling. Marcus, Elena. Victoria's voice carried through the evening air, dripping with effortless entitlement. You're early, but the kitchen is spotless. Please come inside. I've prepared everything to ensure you don't have to breathe the same air as. But Marcus Sterling didn't move toward the door. He didn't even acknowledge Victoria's outstretched hand. He stood by the Maybach, his forward stride, stopping abruptly as his gaze swept the estate with surgical precision. He wasn't looking at the architecture or the manicured lawns. He was looking for something or someone else. I'm not here for the party, Victoria, Marcus said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that seemed to make the very air go silent. Victoria's smile flickered like a circuit right before it fails. She blinked, her dominance momentarily faltering. I don't understand. The gala is the event of the season. My husband has the blueprints for the spire ready for your review in the study. Marcus finally looked at her. But it was the look a man gives to something he has already assessed and moved past. I've already seen the blueprints, Victoria, and I've seen the corrections. I'm not entering a house where the most brilliant mind on this property is sitting in the dirt. He turned his head toward the back porch, toward the isolated, degraded woman sitting beside the dogs. Victoria's face went pale, her lips tightening into a tight, disgusted line as she realized Marcus wasn't looking at her, but at the maid. Aisha felt the heat of his gaze and slowly began to lift her head. Her eyes cast downward, finally meeting the turning point she had set in motion from a library computer. The silence that followed was heavy, permanent, and absolute. The invisible burn of Aisha's humiliation was about to be extinguished by the roar of a reckoning that Victoria Hale never saw coming. The silence that followed Marcus's words was not merely a lack of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the color from Victoria's face. The elegant woman stood frozen on her porch, her arms crossed, in a reflexive attempt to maintain a dominance that was rapidly evaporating in the presence of a truly powerful man. Marcus didn't wait for her to recover. He reached into the Maybach and pulled out a thick roll of blueprints, the same 40-page manifesto Aisha had sent into the digital void from a flickering library monitor. "I've spent the last 48 hours with the best engineering teams in the country," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the humid night like controlled power. He stepped toward the back porch, ignoring the manicured path and walking straight toward the dirt where Aisha sat. "They told me these corrections were impossible. Then they told me they were flawless. They told me that whoever wrote these didn't just save my money. They saved the lives of every person who would have stepped inside that building." Victoria made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, her breezy certainty replaced by a desperate, flickering confusion. "Marcus, my husband is in the study. He's been working on those plans for months. If there were corrections, surely he—" Marcus stopped and unrolled the top sheet, the white lines of the diamond spire gleaming under the estate's security lights. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked directly at the slouched, exhausted woman sitting between the two Dobermans. The dogs, sensing the urgency and authority in his stride, went quiet, their muscular bodies finally still. "Who in this house," Marcus asked, his voice low and authoritative, "knows exactly why the secondary tension cables in the east quadrant needed a 3-degree counter-rotation to offset the soil density?" The question landed in the driveway like a stone in a still pond. Inside the house, the opera music continued to soar, but outside, the world had gone perfectly, terrifyingly still. Victoria opened her mouth, her lips tight, as she looked toward her husband's office, but she had no answer. She was a woman who benefited from silence, but she had never learned the language of the structures she lived within. Aisha felt the heavy sadness and humiliation of the day begin to lift, replaced by a hard-earned certainty that had been buried under years of dirt and blueprints. She didn't rush. She moved with the deliberate grace of a woman who would never again rush herself for anyone else's comfort. She set her tin plate down on the dirt, smoothed the visible stains on her gray uniform, and looked at the dogs one last time. "The counter-rotation isn't just for the soil," Aisha said, her voice clear and unapologetic for the first time in years. "It's to account for the thermal expansion of the glass facade during the Georgia summers. Without it, the tension cables would snap before the building hit the 50th floor." Aisha Coleman stood up from the dirt. She didn't look like the help or a broken servant. She stood with her natural hair held high, her posture no longer collapsed inward, but radiating the hidden genius she had rebuilt in the dark. Marcus Sterling nodded once, a look of recognition and peace crossing his face. He stepped back and opened the rear door of the Maybach, an invitation that signaled the end of Aisha's life of servitude. "Stand up, engineer," he said softly. "We have a city to build, and I believe you're already late for your seat at the table." Victoria Hale's face had moved beyond pale. It was now the color of ash, her breezy certainty disintegrating into a frantic, panicked desperation. She stepped off the porch, her heels sinking into the very dirt where she had just forced Aisha to sit, her arms crossed no longer in dominance, but as if she were trying to hold her crumbling world together. The cold, judgmental mask she had worn for years was slipping, revealing the hollow core of a woman who had quietly borrowed dignity she never intended to return. "Marcus, don't be absurd," Victoria stammered, her voice high and thin against the low, authoritative rumble of the idling Maybach. "The girl is a maid. She cleans toilets and polishes silver. If those notes came from this house, it's because I dictated them. I've been studying my husband's files for weeks. I wanted to surprise you with my own insights for the spire." Marcus Sterling didn't move. He stood with the unbothered calm of a man who had already assessed and moved past a lie. He held up a sleek tablet, the screen glowing with a digital trail of surgical precision. The IP address for the encrypted transmission led directly to the library 3 miles from here, and the secondary login was traced to the guest Wi-Fi on this estate, Marcus said, his voice flat and unapologetic. "It was sent during the hours you were seen at the country club, Victoria. And the architectural shorthand used in these 40 pages hasn't been taught in American universities since the mid-90s. It's the signature of a master, not a socialite. Victoria's lips tightened as she pointed a trembling finger at Aisha, who was now standing with a hard-earned certainty that made her gray uniform look like a royal robe. She probably stole my drafts. She's a fallen empire looking for a way back in. She's a diversity hire who lost her license for a reason. You're going to trust a woman who eats with dogs over me? Aisha didn't wait for Marcus to defend her. She didn't need a token rescue. She looked at the dirt path, the ground that had been meant to be her place of humiliation, and saw it as a blank blueprint. She reached down and picked up a fallen branch, a simple, rough stick, and stepped into the center of the driveway. With the exact pressure she once used to calculate skyscraper loads, Aisha began to draw. She didn't draw a building. She drew the invisible. In the red clay and dust, she etched a complex, nonlinear differential equation, the mathematical proof for the thermal expansion she had just described. Her hand moved with surgical precision, the stick carving lines of hidden genius that Victoria couldn't even begin to read. This is the coefficient of the tension cables, Aisha said, her voice a sound like controlled power. She added a final, sweeping variable to the dirt. And this is the exact moment the steel reaches its yield point under the August heat. If your husband's math was right, Victoria, why did he omit the atmospheric pressure variable for a structure of this height? Aisha dropped the stick. It landed with a quiet thud in the silence that had shattered a woman's arrogance. Marcus looked at the formula in the dirt, then at Aisha, his eyes filled with recognition and peace. Victoria looked at the same lines and saw only her own reckoning. The unmasking was complete. The ghost architect had written her name in the very earth she was supposed to be beneath. And for the first time in years, Aisha Coleman felt exactly like herself. The air on the back porch seemed to thin, the heavy Georgia humidity finally breaking under the weight of the unforgettable reckoning unfolding in the driveway. Victoria Hale stood paralyzed, her gaze darting between the complex formulas etched in the red clay and the blackout Maybach that stood like a monument of controlled power behind Marcus Sterling. The breezy certainty that had defined her life for decades was gone, replaced by the hollow, shattering silence of a woman who realized the furniture in her home had actually been the pillar holding it up. Aisha did not wait for a confession that would never come. She reached for the ties of the gray polyester apron, the visible stains of her long hours and harsh treatment serving as a roadmap of her resilience. With the hard-earned certainty of a woman who would never again rush herself for another's comfort, she untied the knots. She didn't throw the garment. She folded it once, with the same surgical precision she used for her blueprints. She walked toward the porch where Victoria stood, her heels sinking into the dirt she had once claimed was too filthy for Aisha to leave. Aisha held out the folded apron. When Victoria didn't take it, her arms crossed in a desperate, final attempt at dominance, Aisha reached over and draped the cloth over the grill of Victoria's high-end outdoor kitchen, the very place where the stench of poverty was supposed to be kept out of sight. I took a look at the settling patterns in the West Wing while I was scrubbing your baseboards last Tuesday, Aisha said, her voice a low, authoritative rumble that commanded the evening air. The limestone shelf beneath this estate is shifting. Your house is sinking 2 inches every year, Victoria. In 3 years, the marble in your foyer will crack, and in 5, the roofline will begin to buckle. Victoria's lips tightened, her eyes wide with a mix of cold, judgmental disbelief and sudden visceral fear. You're lying. This house was built by the best. It was built by men who ignored the soil density, just like they did on the spire. Aisha interrupted, her face a wall that couldn't be humiliated anymore. She looked at the sprawling mansion, then back at the woman who had treated her like an optional luxury. I'd fix the foundation for you, Victoria. I really would. But I have a city to build, and I'm already behind schedule. The recognition and peace on Marcus Sterling's face was absolute. He stepped aside, holding the door of the Maybach open as Aisha approached. She didn't look back at the slouched, exhausted version of herself that had sat in the dirt 10 minutes ago. She lowered herself into the thousands of dollars of engineering for the first time. And as the leather seat met her back, she felt exactly like herself. The engine caught, a low, unapologetic purr that signaled the end of Aisha's life of servitude. As the Maybach rolled down the long, manicured driveway, leaving Victoria Hale standing alone in the dark beside the dogs and her sinking house, Aisha looked out the tinted window. She saw the Dobermans watching from the fence. The only ones who had seen her as she actually was, and she knew the invisible burn of being dehumanized was finally over. The ghost architect was gone. The partner had arrived. The seasons in Georgia turned with a quiet, invisible burn. But for Victoria Hale, the passage of time felt like the slow realization of a terminal fall. The 3 years following the departure of the Maybach became a 3-year winter. A period where the life she built on top of other people's silence began to crack with terrifying precision. It started as a slow, surgical bleeding of her husband's investments. A series of bad deals and partners who smiled on the way out the door. The Diamond Spire, once the beacon of their social standing, had been seized and redesigned by Sterling's new lead partner, leaving the Hales with nothing but the debt of their own arrogance. While Victoria's world contracted, Aisha Coleman's expanded until she became the queen of the skyline. No longer a ghost in the house, Aisha moved with the hard-earned certainty of a woman who had rebuilt in the ruins. Her name was now etched in steel and glass across the city, a master whose hidden genius was finally liquid and clean. She was no longer a token or a diversity hire. She was the standard by which excellence was measured, a survivor who had turned her scarlet letter into a badge of authority. For Victoria, the collapse was slow, then all at once. The ladies' circle that once sat in her kitchen sipping porcelain coffee had a way of not answering the phone when the news of the Hale bankruptcy got out. The effortless entitlement that had been Victoria's armor was stripped away as the accounts were frozen, and the lawyers became expensive. She found herself sitting at the same kitchen table she had once refused to share with Aisha, staring at a house that was literally and figuratively sinking into the Georgia clay. The final reckoning arrived on a cold morning that smelled of red clay and rain. The bank had finally come for the estate, and the paperwork bore a signature that made Victoria's smile flicker like a circuit right before it fails. The institution foreclosing on her home was the very bank Aisha now advised. The woman she had treated like furniture was now the one who owned the floor Victoria stood on. Victoria walked through the empty rooms, her arms crossed, not in dominance, but as a weight she didn't know how to put down. She looked out at the back porch step where Aisha had once bowed her head and prayed for patience. The Dobermans were gone, sold to pay a fraction of the mounting debts, leaving only the silence of the house to keep her company. Victoria realized with a stabbing clarity that the stench of poverty she had once mocked was now her own reality. She had spent her life deciding the worth of others, only to find herself broken and having nobody show up. As she packed the last of her belongings into a cardboard box, she felt the invisible scarlet letter of failure finally press against her own skin, and for the first time, she understood the true cost of the dirt she had forced another human being to inhabit. The glass and steel lobby of the Sterling Coleman Tower smelled of rain and possibilities, a sharp contrast to the stagnant air of the sinking estate Victoria Hale had once called home. Victoria sat on the edge of a minimalist leather bench, her arms crossed tightly, as if to keep the weight of something she didn't know how to put down from crushing her entirely. She wore no silk blouse or designer jewelry today. She wore the quiet, broken expression of a woman who had spent a long time being someone the world decided didn't deserve a table. When the elevator doors slid open with a low, authoritative hum, Aisha Coleman stepped out. She moved with a hard-earned certainty, her presence commanding the room not through volume, but through the quiet closure of a woman who had finally finished reading a painful chapter of her life. She saw Victoria immediately, the woman who had once forced her to eat with dogs, and she didn't turn away. She didn't call security to remove the contaminant from her lobby. Victoria stood slowly, her voice smaller than she had ever heard it. Aisha, I know I have no right to be here. I know that. But I didn't know who else to call. She stopped, swallowing against the invisible scarlet letter of her own public disgrace. The bank took everything. I have nothing left but the dirt I tried to keep you in. Aisha wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, letting the question breathe in the silence that followed. She looked at Victoria, not with triumph and certainly not with cruelty, but with a recognition that was far more devastating. What you did to me was wrong, Victoria, Aisha said, her voice steady and clear. You looked at me and saw less than I was. That hurt. It still does. But I don't get to decide your worth the way you decided mine. Victoria waited for the blow, for the revenge that made people click share, but it never came. Instead, Aisha reached into her bag and pulled out a keycard. I have an opening in the archives, Aisha said, her face a standard she was holding for herself. It's deep in the foundation of this building, the very place where the blueprints and the history are kept. It's hard work, and you'll start at the bottom, organizing the records of people who actually built this city. Victoria blinked, her eyes filling with the kind of reckoning that comes from being forgiven when you knew you shouldn't be. A job? After everything? Why? Because I know what it feels like to need help and have nobody show up? Aisha replied, her hidden genius, now matched by a generosity that Victoria hadn't earned, but Aisha needed to give. I'm not giving you a chair at my table because you deserve it. I'm giving it because I do. Aisha turned to walk back toward the elevators, her unapologetic stride echoing through the hall she had designed. She had lost her career, her home, and her freedom, but she had never lost her character. As Victoria Hale took the keycard, her hands trembling, she looked at the woman who was no longer the maid, but the architect of her own destiny. Aisha had proven that her soul was never stained by the dirt she sat in. She had simply used that dirt to build a bridge of mercy for the very person who tried to bury her. The ghost architect had finally finished her masterpiece, and it wasn't made of steel. It was made of grace. The most profound lesson from Aisha's journey is that your environment can dictate your comfort, but it can never define your worth. We often mistake our current season of silence for a permanent sentence, allowing the world's limited perception to become our internal reality. Aisha sat in the dirt, but her mind was in the clouds, calculating the weight of skyscrapers while she was treated like furniture. True power doesn't come from the roar of a Maybach or $1 million acquisition. It comes from the standard you hold for yourself when no one is watching. When you choose grace over vengeance and integrity over ego, you prove that your character was never stained by the dirt you were forced to sit in. If you feel overlooked or underestimated today, remember, a foundation is built in the ground, out of sight, before the world ever sees the skyline. Keep building in the dark. Thank you for staying through to the end of Aisha's journey. Your time is precious, and I truly appreciate you sharing these moments of reflection with me. May this story remind you that your value is inherent and your potential limitless.